In some ways, it almost became inevitable that at some point you were going to have a real military clash between Israel and Iran.
What started as an effort to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions has spiraled into something far more dangerous. On June 12th, Israel launched airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and top military officials, igniting a new and very open phase of war between the two countries.
Israel's response in October was to destroy Iran's air defense capabilities. That left Iran open to really what we saw a few weeks ago, which was Israel being able to thoroughly control the skies over Iran.
A ceasefire was announced shortly after President Trump authorized U.S. strikes on Iranian targets. But how long it will hold is uncertain. Has Israel accomplished what it intended? And how could this conflict, and any potential resolution, redraw the security map of the Middle East and reshape America's role in the region?
There are a lot of choices that countries have right now, and we're too soon in the aftermath, I think, to say which way this is going to go.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. In the first of a two-part conversation, we speak with Dr. Michael Koplow, Chief Policy Officer at the Israel Policy Forum, about Israel's strategy, its military objectives, and the high-stakes choices facing U.S. policymakers. Later today, we'll hear the other side, from inside Iran, with journalist Tara Kangarlou. Click on the link in the description to hear that discussion. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
We're very pleased today to have Michael back with us at Network 2020. He is the Chief Policy Officer of Israel Policy Forum. Among his many accolades and degrees, he has a PhD in government from Georgetown University. He also, I would just want to say to everyone, he writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column, which is a wonderful source of commentary on and a lot of analysis on what's happening in the Middle East and in Israel. And so I find it an excellent source. So just wanted to point people to that. So welcome back, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you here. We reached out to you. Obviously, it's been a busy couple of weeks in the Middle East, as usual. And so we wanted just to have a conversation really looking at some of the developments that have happened in the Middle East over the past few weeks and how Israel's strategy is changing within that. So just to set us up, if you wouldn't mind just walking us through this current confrontation between Israel and Iran, how it escalated, but I think our audience knows a lot about some of the key points that happened in the last couple of weeks, but are there other key developments that you think are important to understanding what's happening now?
Sure. So obviously, Israel and Iran have been at loggerheads for a while, and all Israeli leaders, but particularly the current Israeli leader, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have looked at Iran really since the Islamic Revolution in 1979 as Israel's main foe. And over the past couple of decades, maybe even a little longer, as Israeli leaders determined that Iran was trying to get a nuclear bomb, in some ways it almost became inevitable that at some point you were going to have a real military clash between Israel and Iran. And I think that as you rightly point out, people have been following over the past couple of weeks, so no need to go into the exact TikTok of the last couple of weeks. But I do think that there are a few dates in the recent past and maybe even the not so recent past, dates and incidents that are important to mention in terms of figuring out how we got to where we were. I think the first is the JCPOA, the Iran deal, colloquially, in 2015, because that was in many ways an effort on the part of the United States and President Obama to avoid an Israel-Iran clash. The idea being that if you had some sort of nuclear deal, then even if the Israelis didn't like it, and they didn't like it, but if you could demonstrate that it was keeping Iran's nuclear program somewhat bottled up, then even though you were still going to have the issue of Iranian ballistic missiles and Iranian support for proxy groups around the region, that you could avoid a real direct Israel-Iran war. When President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, so at that point, I think you almost had an Israeli expectation that it was going to lead to a U.S.-led or U.S.-supported strike on Iran during President Trump's first term, and it did not happen. And when it didn't happen, at that point, I think the Israelis quickly came to understand that from their perspective, even though they did not like the JCPOA, and I should note that that was really across the board, that wasn't a left-right thing in Israel. But the Israeli security establishment came to understand that there had been logic to it, that it had indeed largely frozen Iran's nuclear program and had left Israel free to deal with these other issues they were dealing with regard to Iran. And now they had to look at everything, but it didn't seem like U.S. help was going to be forthcoming. And so in some ways that put Israel in an even bigger bind than they had been before the JCPOA. And really the October 7th attacks, as devastating as they were for Israel and for Israelis, and of course, for Palestinians in the subsequent almost 2 years, that really led directly to what we saw a couple of weeks ago. Because in the course of the October 7th aftermath, you had Israel first destroy Hezbollah's military capabilities, and Hezbollah had really been Iran's effective deterrence against an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Once that was cleared away, Israel really did not fear the same type of blowback on the Israeli home front from what would happen if they struck at Iran. Second, you had these two Iranian ballistic missile attacks on Israel, the first one in April of 2024 and the second in October 2024. And Israel weathered both of those pretty well, and it gave the Israelis a lot more confidence that in any sort of confrontation with Iran, they would be able to deal with whatever Iran was literally throwing their way. And particularly the aftermath of the October attack was important because Israel's response in October was to destroy Iran's air defense capabilities. That left Iran open to really what we saw a few weeks ago, which was Israel being able to thoroughly control the skies over Iran. And I'd say the last important element was the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. That removed yet another piece of the proxy network from the chessboard, but it also meant that Israel basically had freedom to fly not only over Iran once it had destroyed Iran's air defenses, but over Syria on the way to Iran. And so when you look at all of these things, they really opened up the door for a strike. And when Israeli intelligence determined, as they apparently did, that Iran was moving closer to breakout, I think that these other things really gave the Israelis a huge degree of confidence that even if the United States did not join in, that they would be able to set back the program a decent amount. And so, we saw the operation unfold starting on June 13th, just as an Israeli operation. And then, of course, we saw the United States come in as well. And, here we are now a few weeks later, and there's going to be this ongoing debate as to how much the program has been destroyed. But all these things led to the military action that we saw.
Thank you. Yes, I'm really getting that clear picture of almost a chess or checkerboard with all of the pieces that had kind of managed to not have that open conflict and then slowly getting taken away to the point where it really did happen. In a lot of your recent writings, you've been grappling with some of the choices that face Israel, whether it was, earlier you wrote about whether or not Israel is embarking on a new Lebanon or a new Gaza. That was prior to the U.S. strikes. And then following the U.S. strikes, and as we're kind of going through this damage assessment process, you're writing about the choices that Netanyahu faces. So how would you look at Israel's objectives and strategy in recent weeks, and how might they have shifted now that we do have all of these different pieces that have, in some respects, been moved away?
I think the question of how they have shifted or will shift, remains to be seen, because there are just so many moving parts. But for starters, in a lot of ways, Israel's preference was always to deal with this militarily. Israel, as I noted before, Israelis left, right, center did not like the JCPOA because they've really never trusted that any deal was going to keep the Iranian nuclear program off the table. They tend to view the Iranians as and the regime as being completely untrustworthy, and they assume that any deal is always going to be subject to Iranian cheating, and that there's no way to verify what they're doing. And so, they really thought that ultimately the only way to deal with this was going to be militarily. And I think that, now in the aftermath, where we do have all these conflicting reports, right? There was the initial DIA assessment reported that it only may have set back the Iranian nuclear program a few weeks or a few months. And now we have other assessments pointing the opposite direction. There have been Israeli assessments that are more optimistic in the sense of how far they've set back the program. I think there's new reporting just today from John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, suggesting that destroying the facility that was able to convert enriched uranium into a metal core, is super significant. And so we don't really know. And ultimately, I think that whether you take the most pessimistic assessment or the most optimistic assessment, what it all shows is that military action may have been important and necessary, but it's not sufficient, because at the end of the day, the Iranians are still left with some capability. We don't know how much. They're still left with, facilities somewhere. They're still left with scientists. They're still left with material. They're still left with all these things. And so ultimately, I think the Israelis are now going to have to decide whether what they want to be doing is keeping an eye on Iran's nuclear program. And now that this seal has been broken of military action, striking facilities or personnel every, who knows, few months, few years, whatever it is, and that this will just be a permanent feature of Israeli-Iranian relations as they are, so long as the Islamic regime exists, or whether they want to take the leverage that they now have from these strikes, which, again, even if you take the pessimistic assessment, clearly were significant and clearly have set the Iranians back and have done them a lot of damage, and use that to get a deal that, even if you think the Iranians will be cheating, will be, the phrase that people used to use was longer and stronger with regard to the JCPOA, right? A longer and stronger deal. Whether the Israelis want to use this to get a longer and stronger deal. And I don't think I'm certain they have not decided. I think there's a lot of debate taking place in Israel now about which of these paths makes more sense, which is more feasible. Some of it is going to depend, of course, on an assessment as to what the U.S. will do going forward. And I think that, that too, we're in very interesting territory. On the one hand, President Trump has explicitly said in the past few days that if the U.S. has to strike again, they'll strike again. The flip side is that we are seeing in real time the politicization of whether Iranians' facilities were, quote unquote, obliterated or not. And I think that that's going to impact, certainly under this administration, intelligence and security decisions, because we're now in this space where it's a statement of your political leanings, whether you think Iran's nuclear program has been destroyed or not. And I think that, if I were the Israelis, I would be taking that into account too, because even if there seems to be clear evidence that emerges over the next few months or years that Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan were not completely destroyed, it may be that you have administration officials who are not willing to say that or even grant it for political reasons. So I think the Israelis have a lot of choices that they have to make in front of them. And from the Iranian side too, and I wrote about this a little bit last week, they have a decision. I'm in the camp of people who think that there's a good chance that Iran's lesson from this is that they have to race to break out come hell or high water, because it seems fairly obvious. If you look at North Korea or Libya or even Ukraine, the lesson is if you have a nuclear weapon, you're basically safe from this sort of attack. And if you don't have one, or if you've given up your nuclear weapons or your program, then you can't guarantee regime survival. So I think it's likely that that's the lesson Iran takes. On the other hand, they may look at this as an opportunity and say, we just got set back pretty significantly militarily. We're still under sanctions. We're still relatively unpopular. Maybe this is the time to give up the nuclear program, or at least, give it up substantially in return for hardening the chances of regime survival. So I think that there are a lot of choices that countries have right now, and we're too soon in the aftermath, I think, to say which way this is going to go.
All right. Turning to Israel right now, I'd love just to get your assessment of what's happening internally, and what sort of internal pressures may have shaped the Israeli decision to start to take the attacks on June 13th, and how these most recent events really impact the strength of Netanyahu's government.
So first is, the Iranian nuclear program qua Iran, right? And we've already discussed that. So no need to go into that, I think, in greater depth. But I'd be loath to even suggest that the number one priority here was not actually trying to knock out the nuclear program. With all of that said, there are lots of other things, of course, taking place in Israel. And this has to be viewed against the backdrop of October 7th. October 7th remains this huge trauma for Israelis. And the lesson that they took from it was that you can't sit behind the Israeli border and try to deter threats. You have to act against them before they have a chance to coalesce. And in that sense, I think that the strike on Iran has to be put into this larger context. We've seen Israel, obviously now we're 20 months into, more than 20 months into the war in Gaza, but it's also been the animating idea behind Israeli strikes in Lebanon, Israeli strikes in Syria, Israeli strikes in Yemen, a lot of the activity we're seeing in the West Bank, which is literally unprecedented since Operation Defensive Shield during 2002 in the height of the Second Intifada. And so, if you look around, and we now see Israel effectively in control of about 75% of Gaza, setting up permanent IDF posts inside of refugee camps in the West Bank. There are still 5 Israeli military posts in southern Lebanon, in the frontline Shia villages. There are, at this point, at least 9 and possibly 15 IDF bases inside of Syrian territory. We're seeing this in all sorts of places, and the idea is that you act on these threats before they materialize, and you basically expand Israel's borders, not necessarily politically, but from a security perspective. And so I think that the Iran strike has to be put in that context as well. There's also the fact that the war in Gaza is not going particularly well. And that's not because the IDF has not routed Hamas or taken over most of Gaza. It's because the objectives that were set really are not able to be met. And so Israel is spinning its wheels in Gaza. And I think that, in some ways, the idea of striking at Iran, and particularly in a way that ended up being so successful, was a way of saying, listen, things may not be going so well in Gaza, but look at what we can do in dealing with our greatest foe. And that, of course, is connected to Israeli politics. And Henry Kissinger famously said that Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic policy. And in this case, we have the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, and he's sitting on top of a coalition that at the moment is untenable and is historically unpopular. The Israeli government controls right now 68 seats out of 120 in the Knesset. You need 61 to form a government. And so you think on the face of it that this coalition would be operating from a position of strength, but they aren't, because even though they control 68 seats, and that dates back to the election from the fall of 2022, the last time that the five parties that make up this coalition even approached 61 seats in the polls was March 2023. So we're talking about before the October 7th attacks. And since then, Israel, of course, has gone through, first, before the October 7th attacks, it was the judicial overhaul, which was immensely unpopular. It's really what started the downhill trajectory for this coalition and this government. You then had the October 7th attacks, the worst catastrophe in Israel's history. And since then, the government, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, have been unwilling to take any responsibility for the attacks. They continue to avoid drafting the ultra-Orthodox into the army, and the two ultra-Orthodox parties are two of the five in this coalition. And if there's one issue that unites Israelis, or at least Israeli Jews, across political and social and religious and cultural divides, it's the notion that the ultra-Orthodox parties are shirking their responsibilities and need to really shoulder some of the burden. And this government is associated, like no other government in history, of not sharing equality of burden. And so that's enormously unpopular. And Israelis, they want accountability for October 7th, and they want elections. And so Netanyahu, he's looking at the political calendar. He understands that under the Israeli system, there have to be elections in the fall of 2026, and he needs something that will give him a shot at staying in power. Because if you had an election today, this coalition with 68 seats, it would be down to, it depends on the poll, but somewhere between 49 and 52 seats. I mean, it would be really a historic reversal. And as I said at the beginning, no question to me, first and foremost, this was indeed about the Iranian nuclear program. But you can't separate what happened from the prime minister's political fortunes. And I think that he was taking a political gamble, one that may pay off in some ways, that if he was able to do what he's promised to do for 3 decades and do it in such a spectacular fashion and really set back or even destroy Iran's nuclear program, that would give him the opportunity to call snap elections and, if not win them, at least get to a stalemate, because under Israeli law, and we saw this during the 5 election cycles that took place over the course of 3 years between 2019 and 2022, if nobody can form a new government, the old government stays in place. And I think that he was and he is running out of time. Really, the two things that he could have done that would have been popular and reversed his fortunes, one of them was this. The other would be normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is a far more complicated thing to pull off. And so I suspect that within a few months, I don't think he's going to do it right now. I think he's going to try to get through the Knesset summer session. But I think that once that is done, we very well may see the prime minister dissolve the government and call elections and basically try to run on this success and hope that it is significant enough politically for him to remain in power.
Thank you. You mentioned you mentioned a couple of points that I want to pick up on. You've talked a little bit about the United States and the way the political winds are, how the strikes have been politicized within the United States. But one thing that I think is interesting for people who are studying the geopolitics within the United States is seeing how President Trump is navigating this, because it's not always exactly what one might expect. So I'm curious if you could dig in a little bit more into what you were saying earlier about how Israel would need to understand what's happening politically in the United States. How is Israel navigating this vis-a-vis Washington? Are interests aligned? Where are you seeing signs of divergence, and where are there signs of convergence, and what do you think might happen?
So before Israeli strikes on Iran, there was obviously a debate here as to what the United States was going to do and whether the United States would support it. And I was surprised. I was surprised by the Israeli strike, and I was then a little less surprised by the United States joining in. But I did not view it as a fait accompli, and it is because of the political dynamics here in the United States. I have always taken, and I take President Trump at his word that he wants to avoid foreign entanglements, that he does not want the U.S. bogged down in the Middle East. And I think that, and particularly, if you've seen the number of times he's now posted about the Nobel Peace Prize just in the past week, this is obviously, an animating incentive for him. And, what we saw really over the past few months was this effort on the part of the United States and on the part of President Trump to try to get to some sort of deal with the Iranians. President Trump was the one who pulled out of the Obama JCPOA. It seems pretty clear to me that he wanted a Trump JCPOA. Or a Trump deal of some sort, which also makes it even more interesting that now today he's posting again that there are going to be no negotiations with Iran after there were reports yesterday that there were going to be negotiations with Iran. So we can we can parse this in all sorts of different ways. But I think that anybody paying attention to U.S. politics understands the different push and pull on President Trump within his coalition. The MAGA coalition and MAGA world is very much against the use of American power overseas in ways that don't translate very directly into what they view as American interests. There's a reason that there was huge MAGA pushback against the idea of the United States getting involved in any sort of Israel-Iran war, or even supporting Israel in an Israel-Iran war. And then on the other hand, you have lots of traditional Republican Iran hawks. And so, I think that you had this divide within the president's coalition, and you saw it play out not just over the past 2 weeks, but I think over the past few months. Which is why, as I said, I did not think that Israel was going to do something like this without a U.S. green light, and I wasn't sure that there was going to be a U.S. green light. Now, we've seen reporting subsequently that that demonstrated that President Trump indeed had told the Israelis not to do it, and over the course of 2 months of on again, off again negotiations with Iran, he came to the conclusion that the Islamic regime was perhaps playing games and wasn't necessarily serious about getting to a negotiation, and that seems to have led him to say to the Israelis, "Sure, go ahead." And then when he saw how successful the Israeli strikes were, he clearly wanted in, and so the U.S. joined, and ultimately. Again, too soon to tell how much of a success, but on the face of it, this looks like a pretty big military success, and one that actually fit into even the more isolationist MAGA view of what the U.S. should be doing, which was the U.S. went, it dropped a bunch of bombs, turned around, and we do not have, at least as of yet, wider U.S. involvement in a big Middle East war, which is exactly what I think a large part of President Trump's coalition wants to avoid. Now, if you're the Israelis going forward, you have to keep these divides in mind, because this was a very limited U.S. operation in all sorts of ways, right? Limited in terms of being time-bound, in terms of what we actually expended, in terms of getting bogged down in the aftermath. And so if the Israelis think that they're going to have to keep on doing this, I think that there's definitely an open question as to whether the U.S. political system is going to support it. We've talked about President Trump's coalition, but let's not forget that we still are in a two-party system, and Democrats have been extremely wary of what just happened. We had the effort to pass a war powers resolution that would have effectively denied future U.S. ability to strike Iran absent congressional authorization for use of military force. It divided almost exactly along party lines. You had Rand Paul vote with Democrats, and you had John Fetterman vote with the Republicans. But if you're the Israelis and you're looking at this, Democrats were not supportive of this, and I think that you can't separate the fact that it's because it was President Trump. Had President Biden done it, you'd still have many Democrats who were not supportive, but I think would have had others who were. Republicans, like I said, seem to be okay with how it transpired, but I don't think would be okay with much longer involvement. And so, whereas Israel got what they wanted this time from the United States in terms of the exact level of U.S. involvement that Israel could not do on its own, given that we had 30,000-pound MOPs and massive ordnance penetrators, and Israel does not. Going forward, there definitely has to be a question as to what U.S. involvement will be, and I think that the Israeli government understands the dynamics here pretty well, and they should be taking that into account when thinking about what happens next.
You had mentioned Saudi Arabia and a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia as being a wonderful goal, but for Israel, but also a very hard one to navigate. Just kind of stepping back from there, just looking at the region more broadly, how are regional powers reacting to this confrontation, and how does that reaction square with other regional reactions and interests regarding what Israel's actions in Gaza?
The Gulf states did not want to see Israeli or U.S. military action in Iran, and they were messaging that pretty clearly. They were doing it publicly. I myself, have heard it from them in the region privately, and all the reporting around President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar in the spring suggests that they were telling President Trump the same thing when he was there. Now, it's not because there's all this conversation about Saudi and Emirati rapprochement with Iran. I don't think it's because the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, or anybody else decided that they were hunky dory with the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's because their view of the region was it's more important for there to be quiet and stability. They do not want extended military conflicts in the region. They almost all came to the position that they could effectively buy off the Iranians by restoring relations and having trade ties, and that if that happened, the Iranians would leave them alone. So they were nervous about military action. Now, this was probably the best case scenario for them, right? It was 12 days of strikes. It did not engulf the region in a wider war. Iran did not attack Saudi or Emirati or Bahraini facilities. They did attack in Qatar, but they attacked the U.S. base in Qatar in a way that was designed to have no casualties and for basically everybody to be able to stand down afterward. So I think for them, this was literally the best case scenario. And I should note that none of them are fans of the Iranian nuclear program. So, to the extent that this set it back a significant amount, this really is the best case scenario for them. With that said, they want to see this put to bed. And, that probably means some sort of negotiation or deal. As opposed to 2015, where not just Israel, but the Gulf states were also wary of a deal with Iran. That is no longer the case. They kind of want to have this behind them. They want the region to focus on trade and business and economics, particularly the Saudis, who I think are now in either the second or third year of running a deficit, which is just staggering when you think about the history of the Saudi economy. In order to fulfill the Crown Prince's 2030 vision, they need investment, and that means not having the region in war. So they would like to see this put to bed. Now, as you mentioned, the Israel-Iran conflict is not the only part of this. A big part of this is Gaza, and that goes to the question of normalization. Before October 7th, Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to a normalization deal. Anybody who was paying attention publicly to what the Biden administration was doing, could see that on its face. I've had conversations with many U.S. and Israeli officials who were working on this stuff at the time, and I think the two sides really were closer than even people understood at the time. The Gaza war makes that very difficult because the politics of this, certainly across the region, but in Saudi Arabia in particular, have shifted. And whereas before the October 7th attacks, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was very much on the back burner in Saudi Arabia, just like in Israel, it's effectively now front page news all day, every day. And it really has become a huge problem for MBS. And his politics on this are just very different than they were before. And the idea that the two sides can simply shake off 20 months of war in Gaza and 55,000 Palestinians who have been killed, and the huge level of destruction. The idea that even if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, that Saudi Arabia could sort of just go back, go back to square one as if none of this happened, I think is fanciful. So in order for there to be real regional normalization, the war in Gaza has to end, but I think it's gonna take a bit more time. And also important to remember that for the Saudis, even before October 7th, normalization with Israel was a goal, but that's not what was driving the normalization conversation. What was driving the conversation was that there were a lot of things that Saudis wanted from the United States. And the price for those things was going to be, in part, normalization with Israel. When President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, he struck a number of deals with them and agreed to a number of things that would have been part of a normalization deal and now are part of a bilateral negotiation. And what that means is that the Saudis still want to normalize with Israel. It's not something that they're opposed to, but it's no longer the case that they have to do that in order to get a bunch of other things. And so I think that pushes it off a bit as well. And so the Saudis just generally are going to be more cautious on this. But what's going on in Gaza has far greater impact on this question of normalization than I think the Iran-Israel war does. And it's why you now see this messaging coming from President Trump, where he's now urging in all sorts of ways an end to the Gaza war, because he understands that while it's still going on, his wider vision for the region, which ultimately does include Israel-Saudi normalization, is going to be impossible.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. We are at time. Michael, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. As you said, I think it's still early to, everything evolves over time, but I hope we can have you back one day and see how things are going. With that, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening. Have a great day, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Don't miss part 2 of our discussion on the Iran-Israel conflict. Later today, we'll hear from journalist Tara Kangarlou on how Iranians are viewing the war with Israel. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you soon.